Logan Paul is going to be on SmackDown next Friday, and the internet wrestling community, they're not a big fan of this decision. So I asked in our poll in our community page whether or not it's the same as Shaquille O'Neal in AEW. 73% said it's different. So we're going to talk about it next on the Squared Circle Psychobabble. My name is Michael Valenti. Joining me is Ralph Valenti. Ralph, why do I feel like you're going to be part of the 23% saying that this is the same?
At face value, you know, they're the same in the sense that this is essentially like a marketing thing. This is WWE or AEW, whatever company decides they're going to utilize a celebrity. They're trying to bring the value of whatever celebrity they're bringing into the company to their company. So if WWE decides they want to bring in Logan Paul, they assume that they're going to bring in some eyes to their product that wouldn't normally be watching WWE product. If AEW goes out and they decide they're going to include Shaquille O'Neal or Mike Tyson, you know, they're doing that for a reason as well. Now, where they're different, and this is probably part of the discussion we're going to have, is ultimately how they're used. Do I think that I find myself in that 23%? Maybe. I guess I'll let the people decide that after we have our conversation here. But I think at face value, at the root of it, they are essentially being used or utilized and brought into the companies, whether it's AEW or WWE, to try and promote their program to people who wouldn't normally watch.
Right. So I think we should break this down as to how they're the same, how they're different. So let's start with how they're the same, because I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head there on how they're the same. They are outsiders trying to bring in a new fan base. It's plain and simple. Whether that is Shaquille O'Neal, whether that is Bad Bunny, whether that is Mike Tyson, whether that's Logan Paul. They have their audience, and WWE and AEW try to bring in a new audience to expose and grow their audience. It's as simple as that. I don't know what other similarity there really is besides that.
I think whenever a celebrity is brought into pro wrestling, especially in pro wrestling, because, you know, I think that a majority of the fan base will react a certain way. A lot of times it's negative. But celebrities have been used throughout the history of pro wrestling for a very long time. And you can go back to looking to Andy Kaufman's rivalry with Jerry Lawler. You can look at Floyd Mayweather having his match against The Big Show. This most recent stint here, whether you talk about Shaq, Tyson, Bad Bunny, there's a natural reaction, I think, for the fans to kind of push back a little bit, because a lot of times we focus on pro wrestling as being the pro wrestling aspect of it, what you see in the squared circle or what you're seeing in the ring as part of the match.
Right.
And you don't necessarily think about the marketing aspect of it or the ability to try and grow and expand your audience to people who aren't going to watch on a weekly basis. And that's really what this is about, trying to bring in those additional eyes, trying to bring in somebody who maybe knows who Logan Paul is or knows who Shaq is or knows who Tyson is and wouldn't normally be tuning in to your product. I mean, that worked for the WWE with Tyson during the Attitude Era. It certainly worked for AEW with Shaq. When Shaq had his match, I think that was probably the highest viewed segment in AEW Dynamite history. It was
I don't know
over
about
1 million
history.
viewers.
I don't know about history, but on that show,
Right.
it definitely was one of the highest.
Right. And I think the natural reaction for the fans, the wrestling fans, especially the hardcore wrestling fans, is to naturally push back and try to say that, you know, they don't want to see it. They're not interested. And you got to understand, this isn't always about pleasing you. It's about trying to bring in additional eyes to the product. So if I'm a fan of WWE product, I can watch Raw, I can watch SmackDown, and we know that obviously Logan Paul is going to be on SmackDown. We know that Bad Bunny has been on Raw. I don't have to watch those segments if I don't want to.
Right.
You have the ability to fast forward. You have the ability to skip over it. You could change the channel. You could do whatever you want. So at the end of the day, you can choose to watch those segments if you want to, and you can choose to change the channel if you don't want to watch those segments. I think it mostly comes down to the value of the person that you're bringing into the company. And I know a lot of people said this. I don't know who Logan Paul is. That's fine, but we can't sit here and pretend that Logan Paul has no value or he's bringing nothing to the table for WWE, because he certainly is. Do you agree with that part of it, at least before we kind of dive into it?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And that's a great segue to go into why they're different. And I think the main reason why these are different between Shaq and Logan Paul is the audience that is being targeted is definitely different, because you look at Logan Paul, A lot of people are like, who's Logan Paul? Who's Logan Paul? Well, that's because the average age of a wrestling fan, I mean, Meltzer's brought this up, Brian Alvarez has brought this up, WrestleNomics has brought this up. It's an older audience. And with AEW being the younger skewing audience, the average age is 47. So the 47-year-old and older are most likely not using Instagram, most likely not using Twitter, most likely not on YouTube. Yes, there are people over the age of 47 that use YouTube, that use Twitter, that use Instagram. I'm not saying it's not impossible, but those formats are for younger skewing audiences.
Right.
For those that don't know who Logan Paul is the guy that has 25 million YouTube subscribers. That's 10 times more than AEW's channel. Now, granted, Logan Paul's been doing this a lot more than AEW's been in existence. I'll give you that. Also, Logan Paul has 19 million Instagram followers, which is more than Shaquille O'Neal, which is 4 times more than Sasha Banks, which is more than 4 times more than Roman Reigns. So he's tapping into a younger audience. Whereas Shaq, what he's doing, every wrestling fan knows who Shaq is. Every person that is a male that's 47 and older knows who Shaq is. Whether they saw him playing in LSU, whether they saw him playing in the NBA with the Orlando Magic, with the LA Lakers, the Cavaliers, the Heat, wherever he played, you know who Shaq is. Maybe you're like me and you, Ralph, in our younger 30s that once played Shaq Fu on Sega Genesis. So, everyone knows who Shaq is in the diehard wrestling community. They probably don't know who Logan Paul is unless they were one of those million people that bought his boxing match not too long ago, and probably the other million that are going to buy the eventual Mayweather match, which, might I add, was the reason why Revolution moved dates, was because of Logan Paul and Floyd Mayweather's match.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the pay-per-views there, because I think the thing that we're seeing most from the diehard wrestling fans is this. I don't know who Logan Paul is. Why are they bringing him in? He's a pretend boxer. All of these types of insults. And mind you, again, this was the same thing, literally probably the same conversation we had, 2 months ago, about Bad Bunny? Because when Bad Bunny was brought into the WWE, what did everybody say?
Who's Bad Bunny?
Who's Bad Bunny? I don't know who he is. Why is he on WWE? Why is he there? Well, little did people know that, first of all, he's a major international star, right? So that's number one. And what did he bring? He brought value to the WWE, and he was like, number one for t-shirt sales for something like 2 or 3 weeks.
Like
whatever
four of his shirts were the top selling shirts. And the only person that came close was Roman Reigns.
Okay, so that's my point here. Just because you don't know who a celebrity is doesn't mean that other people aren't paying attention to this individual, or that they're not bringing anything to the table, and that their name or their brand has no value. Okay, now let's look at Logan Paul, right? And you brought up the millions of people who subscribe to his YouTube, the millions of followers that he has on Instagram. Those are the people that the WWE is trying to tap into. You brought up the pay-per-view buys. I just want to throw out some numbers here. If
Go ahead.
You were to search, if you searched most pay-per-view sales of all time in history, wrestling, boxing, everything, Logan Paul versus KSI, which, did I watch it? No. Do I pay attention to Logan Paul? No, I don't watch his YouTube stuff, but he sold 1.3 million pay-per-views. Okay, so obviously people, for whatever reason, have enough of a attraction or affiliation or loyalty to Logan Paul to buy a pay-per-view for a guy who supposedly is a pretend boxer, as the wrestling community is putting it. You can try to delegitimize it all you want, but that is what they're trying to tap into. Those 1.3 million pay-per-view buys put it ahead of WrestleMania's 22, 20, 17, where Rock and Austin faced off, 29, where Cena and Rock faced off, 24, where Flair wrestled HBK in his retirement match, WrestleMania 27, 21, 23, which had Donald Trump, 28, where Cena and Rock had their match, and then UFC fights where Lesnar fought Randy Couture, Weidman fought Silva, Lesnar fought Cain Velasquez, Tito Ortiz and Chuck Liddell, the rematch, which their first one was a huge success, Nunez and Ronda Rousey for Ronda's return, and Lesnar and Carwin, and UFC 200. So we can sit here and we can talk about Logan Paul all we want and try to delegitimize it and try to say, well, why is the WWE doing this? And you can try to suggest that he has no credibility and he has no value, but it's simply not true. The numbers don't suggest it. There's nothing that you can point to that suggests he's not going to bring anything to the table for WWE, the same way Shaq would bring something to the table for AEW, in the same way they've done this throughout the history of pro wrestling, whether it's been Mr. T, Mickey Rourke, Cyndi Lauper. I mean, it's an endless list of celebrities. This is what they're trying to do to help grow the brand for pro wrestling, whether you're the WWE or AEW. And this is a good thing overall. You don't have to watch it, but at least try to understand why they're doing these types of things.
Right.
Pat
And I think
McAfee is another example too. He was another guy where people were like, oh, we don't want to see him wrestle. And then what ended up happening? He was great.
Yeah.
One of the best heels throughout the 2020.
Right. I'm glad you brought up Pat McAfee and one of the best heels of 2020, because I think those that do know Logan Paul, this is where it's another difference between Shaq and Logan Paul is the reasoning behind the backlash. Now, people might not like celebrities in pro wrestling, but I think this is beyond that, because those that don't like the decision, it's not just because WWE is bringing in another celebrity for a ratings pop or a cash gain or whatever. I think it's the backstory of Logan Paul, and they bring up the vlog that he did in, I think it was 2016, 2017, where he went through the suicide forest in Japan and exploited, dead bodies and showed that on YouTube and got a whole lot of mess for that. I think people don't forget that and don't like him for that. And I think that's part of the backlash. And some people could be like, hey, use that as heat, and he's going in to support a heel on SmackDown. So I understand that aspect. If that's the reason why they find it different, if that's the reason why they don't like this compared to Shaq, I'm okay with that reasoning personally.
There's two things that I've noticed for most of the backlash from, on social media and whatnot. People who are trying to say that he has no value because he's a pretend boxer, he's a YouTuber, whatever. If that's going to be your argument, I'm sorry, you don't really have a leg to stand on, because the numbers are there. He's got more than enough loyal following and all of those types of things to support why WWE is bringing him in. Now, if you want to say that they're bringing in somebody who has that whole background and all of that type of stuff, and the type of stuff that surrounds his name, that's obviously not good stuff from the video that you're talking about, then yeah, that's a credible, I think, legitimate argument where WWE probably is going to get some backlash for bringing him in. That is a risk that WWE is taking. I think that AEW certainly took a risk when they brought Tyson in, because Tyson certainly doesn't have a squeaky clean background either. And I don't recall that being mentioned all that much, but you know what? It is what it is. A lot of people have done things in the past. I know he apologized for it, and it doesn't certainly make it right. So I think ultimately what it comes down to is how much backlash are they really going to get after he makes his appearance, and what do they do with him?
Right. And
how are they going to book him?
Right. I think that's the other difference here that we got to talk about, is the sheer fact that unless the Sami Zayn versus Kevin Owens match somehow turns into a tag team match, which I doubt, or a handicap match, which I doubt, Logan Paul's appearance on WWE is strictly non-wrestling. Whereas Shaq, people, they bring this up. Shaq is a big wrestling fan. Shaq wanted to be in the ring. I mean, we almost got the match between Shaq and Big Show all those years ago. For some reason, it didn't happen. If there was a falling out, whatever the case may be. With TNT and the NBA and Shaq being part of that, it was easy crossover, and that's part of the reason for this happening. Whereas Logan Paul, there's no crossover here. Is he a fan? I recently saw an interview with him and The Miz where he mentioned that he's a casual fan. He does not watch every week. He does not know every wrestler, but he grew up watching The Ultimate Warrior, and he mentioned that. So for those that saying he's not a wrestling fan, he is just not a mark, plain and simple. So there's a difference there. And the fact that he won't be wrestling, I think that's where Shaq and Bad Bunny is more likely similar than it is where it's Logan and Shaq are similar.
If the intent is for Shaq to come in and work a match, well, okay, then he's working a match. Not every celebrity is going to come into any company and be utilized and expected to have a match. You know, like I said, Mickey Rourke was brought in when The Wrestler was a really popular movie that was out, and Jericho had his little beef with him. Mayweather was brought in and he had a match against Big Show. Whatever the situation may be, and the situation at hand right now is Sami Zayn, and this kind of speaks to the point I was trying to make earlier. Sami Zayn is a heel.
Right.
He's supposed to get booed. Now,
Yes.
I know a lot of times in current times, you don't always boo the bad guy, but the intent is for him to be booed because he's the heel. Now, you bring in a guy like Logan Paul, who's not necessarily a huge wrestling fan, as you pointed out, who a lot of wrestling fans probably don't want to see in wrestling right now. So does that mean he's going to get booed? Does that mean that Sami Zayn is going to be booed because of his association with Logan Paul? If so, then that's actually a good thing. That's a strategic move by WWE to not only bring in viewers that wouldn't normally watch, but to also get people to boo Sami Zayn, who is the heel. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that they're bringing in somebody from outside WWE that's a natural heel or somebody that is going to get heat or get booed. That's a good thing. That's good for Sami Zayn and the dynamic that he's trying to go with all of this conspiracy theory nonsense that he's been talking. So I don't think it's a bad thing.
Right.
Not every single celebrity that's ever been brought into wrestling has been expected to wrestle. So if Logan Paul is strictly brought in for his association with Sami Zayn to be booed and to draw heat, then okay, they're utilizing him fine. He shouldn't be expected to wrestle.
Right. And that's all it is. It's a heat magnet. And plain and simple. Eyes on the product, heat magnet for Sami Zayn grows the audience. Hopefully, Sami Zayn does and Kevin Owens do what they need to do to keep those fans in that Logan Paul is going to attract to WWE next week.
And if this ends with Logan Paul getting the crap kicked out of him by Kevin Owens, as a wrestling fan, for somebody who doesn't like him or doesn't want to see him in wrestling, isn't that probably what people want to see at the end of the day?
Yes, and that gets Kevin Owens over huge.
Yeah, so I mean, I just think that sometimes wrestling fans react irrationally and just overanalyze things. It's not that big of a deal that they're bringing him in.
Right. So at the end of the day, is it the same or is it different?
At the core of it, it's the same because they're all these celebrities are brought in to bring eyes to the product, the same way that celebrities are used in commercials to try and promote another product. So at the core of it, they're all brought in for the same reason. It's just how are they utilized, and that's the difference between them.
Right. I agree. They're the same but different. But in the comments, you can let us know how we're right or how we're wrong. And don't forget to share us all over social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at SCPB Podcast. Join that conversation by subscribing, hitting that bell for notifications, and liking this video. And we'll talk to you on the next episode of the Squared Circle Psychobabble.